It began quietly, almost too quietly for something that would change the course of civilization. There was no explosion, no flash in the sky, no grand catastrophe to announce that the pulse of the modern world had stopped, only a subtle emptiness. At first, it was a morning like any other. Coffee machines hissed, screens glowed, millions of fingers typed words that would vanish in seconds. On the stock exchanges of New York, Frankfurt, Tokyo, digital numbers flickered as if driven by some invisible heart. And then, in the space of a single breath, that heart stopped. Across the planet, the internet, that vast invisible nervous system of humanity, simply ceased to exist. No one could explain it. Routers still blinked, but they blinked into nothing. Satellites orbited silently, but their signals no longer found a home. Every packet of data, every request, every ping that sought another machine dissolved into the void, like words spoken into a dead radio. It was as if an organ had been removed from the body of civilization, and, for a moment, the world stood still, trying to remember how to breathe without it. At first, disbelief. People refreshed pages again and again, waiting for the familiar glow of connection. When the first hour passed, news anchors on television reassured viewers. Temporary technical failure, possibly a global routing issue. Engineers are working on it. But television itself depended on the same arteries that had gone dry. Streaming platforms froze mid-sentence, leaving faces twisted in digital rigor mortis. Within 2 hours, even traditional media faltered. Many had abandoned analog systems long ago. By the evening of the first day, the digital hum of the world, 12 billion devices whispering in unison, fell completely silent. For decades, people had compared the internet to the brain of humankind, and they were right. Without it, all global coordination instantly broke down. Planes still flew, but navigation systems hiccuped and pilots reverted to paper charts like aviators of the 1940s. Ships drifted without GPS, uncertain of their coordinates. Millions of online transactions, deliveries, data centers, and banking transfers vanished mid-operation. No virus, no war, no cyber attack could have caused something this total. It was as though the fabric itself had been ripped, a metaphysical blackout, not merely a technical one. Governments called emergency sessions. Presidents and ministers sat in conference rooms, stripped of digital dashboards and real-time intelligence. Paper maps returned to tables, as did printed reports, couriered by hand. Somewhere in Washington, an aging fax machine whirred to life for the first time in 20 years. But even then, few grasped what was truly happening. Humanity had lost not only its communications, it had lost its reflection. By the second day, panic spread like wildfire. Banks could no longer access accounts. Logistics chains froze. Supermarkets could not order resupply, and ATMs stopped functioning. Those with cash felt briefly safe until they realized that digital registers and inventory systems had no way to confirm transactions. Stock markets, entirely digital, evaporated in seconds. The global economy, worth hundreds of trillions, became an abstraction without access to its own memory. Within 24 hours, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history occurred, from digits on screens to whatever physical goods one could touch, carry, or defend. An old economist in Paris compared it to the crash of 1929, but he was wrong. The Great Depression was a wound, this was decapitation. On the streets, confusion gave way to fear. Social media had been the nervous chatter of civilization, its gossip, anger, solidarity, and illusion of unity. Now, silence. The great digital plaza where billions gathered daily was empty. There were no hashtags, no outrage, no guidance. The voice of humanity had vanished. Without coordination, protests sparked spontaneously in dozens of cities, fueled by rumors, distrust, and the eerie vacuum of truth. Conspiracy theories multiplied faster than facts could travel. Someone claimed it was China's doing, others swore it was an American weapon. A preacher in Nairobi called it the Day of Reckoning. A blogger in Sao Paulo, writing on a typewriter, proclaimed the end of the digital age and the revenge of reality. Across continents, People rediscovered slowness. They looked up, literally, seeing the unmediated faces of their neighbors for the first time in years. Some smiled. Others locked their doors. In the first 72 hours, the world experienced what philosophers would later call the Great Silence. News no longer traveled at the speed of light, but at the speed of footsteps and voices. A man in Rome might learn about events in Berlin 3 days later, carried by a truck driver or a newspaper printed from local rumor. For the first time since the 19th century, time itself fragmented. Civilization no longer lived in sync. Governments deprived of their digital eyes turned inward, borders tightened, armies reverted to analog coordination, radio relays, signal flags, field messengers. Militaries discovered that most of their command infrastructure had been built on fragile networks. A general in Moscow was said to have wept when he realized his entire satellite constellation was useless without terrestrial routing. And yet, amid confusion, something strange, almost sacred, began to happen. In the absence of infinite noise, silence revealed the raw architecture of human dependence. A letter once again became the fastest means of confirmed communication. Libraries filled with people seeking printed maps, encyclopedias, anything that might replace Google. In universities, professors lectured to packed halls for decades. Their words, once drowned by endless content, now mattered again. The digital tide had retreated, exposing the seabed of memory. People discovered forgotten rituals, handwritten notes, neighborhood meetings, storytelling. In the city of Prague, candles flickered in cafes as strangers shared news gathered from travelers. One woman read aloud from a printed encyclopedia about how messages were once sent by telegraph. The crowd listened as if she were describing sorcery. But as night deepened, another feeling crept in: dread. For decades, humanity had stored everything it loved in the cloud. Not only photos and letters, but the infrastructure of knowledge itself: research, blueprints, medicine, navigation, archives. Now all of it lay beyond reach. Hospitals lost access to patient databases. Air traffic systems, power grids, financial institutions all ran on networks that no longer spoke to one another. The world was not broken, it was mute. By the end of the first week, some realized the truth. The internet had not merely crashed, it had vanished. All global routing protocols erased, as though by an unseen hand, and no one, anywhere, could rebuild it from scratch in less than months. Historians of the future would mark that moment as the true beginning of the 30 days of disconnection, the moment when humanity, stripped of its second consciousness, was forced to rediscover its first, as if the entire species had awakened from a digital dream into a world that looked the same but sounded terrifyingly quiet. The age of connection had ended. The age of consequence had begun. I called the second week the Great Descent into the Past, not because the world had returned to the 19th century, but because people instinctively began to search for the old threads that once stitched space and trust together before digital protocols existed. The first shock had passed, and the silence no longer screamed. It had settled into a low vibration beneath the skin, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Electricity still lit the lamps, the motors still hummed, elevators still moved, but the network was gone. We lived inside a machine that still functioned, yet had lost its voice. That week, the paper web was born. Where automatic doors and glowing QR menus once stood, there appeared corkboards with handwritten notes, rolls of tape, and push pins. In supermarkets, they printed inventory lists on receipt paper. In pharmacies, working hours were scribbled and taped to the door. In apartment courtyards, people pinned up news sheets, copied by hand from local radio broadcasts. The librarian wrote their opening hours in chalk and distributed atlases, manuals, and encyclopedias as if they were rations. The librarian became the dispatcher of the city's memory. The Middle Ages returned, not as nostalgia, but as an institution, heralds. On city squares, men with megaphones appeared reading government announcements twice a day, water schedules, clinic hours, lists of supplies that had arrived. I listened to them the way Weimar citizens once listened to the exchange rate of the mark, not out of curiosity, but cold fear of tomorrow. In my pocket, I carried 2 pencils and a small notebook, my personal telegraph, my own fragile backup of the world. Were telephones working? Partly. Old analog lines still buzzed, and emergency services kept their radio frequencies alive, but most modern fiber and digital routing were dead. Local islands of communication flickered to each other through shortwave channels, like lighthouses in fog. Unable to see beyond their own coasts, the borders of our world shrank to the limits of the city, the district, sometimes just the neighborhood. The second week revealed the moral of trust. Banks, those cathedrals of modernity, had lost their altar. The lights were on, safes intact, but the invisible thread of verification was gone. Digital ledgers had torn apart, and every transaction became a small drama reminiscent of 2008, only without Bloomberg or Reuters, without a world feed. "Show me your money," said the cashier, meaning not an account, but paper or metal. Card terminals blinked politely in helplessness. Some whispered about offline chip limits, but without synchronization, it was like gambling on blind faith. Local currencies began to bloom like weeds in a cracked pavement. Markets reverted to cash, first in national dollars, and when that ran short, to printed vouchers, coupons, even wooden tokens stamped with a neighborhood seal. Don't laugh. Towns in Central Europe once did the same during the age of hyperinflation, when value existed only where community blessed it. A bread coupon became stronger than millions in an unreachable digital account. Money was once again worth only as much as the person handing it to you. In logistics warehouses, the air smelled of dust, grease, and embarrassment. Yesterday they ran on APIs and automatic docks. Today on folders, pens, and markers. Trucks moved not where algorithms sent them, but where a dispatcher's phone call could reach. Maps were paper again, routes drawn by pencil, fuel measured not in spreadsheets, but in guarded barrels. At the gates stood policemen with clipboards. Handwritten manifests were now more trustworthy than any tokenized system. I watched as the city stitched up its old scars to prevent decay. Stores introduced quiet windows, hours reserved for the elderly to buy bread and milk without chaos. Pharmacies posted lists of substitute medicines. Schools hung schedules for parents to pick up printed assignments, since digital classrooms were now empty shells. "We're learning silently again," a principal told me, and somehow the children are reading textbooks. Radio became what it was always meant to be, the bone and spine of reason. On AM frequencies, voices rose like beacons, kitchen receivers, basement transmitters, field radios. At 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening, government spoke. Numbers, reserves, transport, medicine. The broadcasts were dry but deeply human. They didn't try to persuade, only to prevent panic. Announcers spoke slowly, as if teaching the ear how to understand a world with missing signals. I copied their words into my notebook, like monks once copied scripture. Important figures, useful addresses, office hours. In these days, handwriting became salvation. If something written survived the night, it was more real than a blinking screen had ever been. Downtown, a new institution appeared, light rooms. Co-working spaces with dead routers became public help centers, tables, lamps, paper, typewriters. There, volunteers compiled whitebooks of each district. Who had a generator, who had a well, where the veterinarian worked, which warehouses were open, and under what conditions. Intelligence replaced technology. The person who could maintain an inventory ledger by hand was suddenly more valuable than any influencer with 1,000 unseen followers. Of course, not all was noble. The vacuum of information summoned false prophets. On bridges, squares, and subway tunnels bloomed leaflets shouting certainties: who was guilty, where the enemy hid, what to do with the traitors. It was the 20th century all over again. When there is no channel for truth, truth becomes whoever shouts first. Countries that remembered the sting of totalitarian propaganda acted with caution. Those without such memory turned to loud parades of patriotism, echoes of 1933 in modern clothes. Around day 10, I received a letter, a real one, sealed with the golden emblem of the university. A dusty, smiling student delivered it by hand. "Professor," my colleague wrote, "we've resumed seminars in room 12. It's now a local assistance bureau for small businesses. Bring your notebooks. We're compiling a guide for shopkeepers and craftsmen, how to keep accounts without the internet, how to track inventory, how to maintain a ledger. And please bring those newspapers from 1998 to 2001, the ones with columns about living offline." Someone had scribbled at the bottom in blue pen, "Bring a warm scarf. The room's cold." New markets emerged, not of goods but of time and reliability. Courier companies began sealing envelopes with lead stamps, like in the 1800s, charging not by distance but by certainty. "Delivered tomorrow before 4 p.m. Reputation replaced fuel as the currency of movement. Old digital cargo, SSDs with databases, flash drives with backups, printouts of code, started traveling by train, truck, and air. Thus were born the packet caravans, guarded briefcases carrying not products but information that had become physical again. In the business district, I saw a line outside a sync point, a small office with 2 computers and a clerk in gloves who accepted USB drives, stamped received, and a day later stamped dispatched. It was a temple of the new old logistics, a network stitched together by shoe leather. Governments, slowly recovering from the shock, began building what they called the bridge of translation, temporary internal lines between critical nodes, central banks and clearinghouses, customs and ports, hospital networks and pharmacies. Legal private channels, quote, dark fibers, rose again as autonomous corridors. No internet, no routing, just point to point. The work fell not to modern IT specialists, but to veteran engineers of telegraph and railway networks. They rebuilt pipelines of trust. Narrow, monitored, stripped to essentials. It felt like the industrial mobilization of wartime, the maximum of simple technology for the minimum of vital tasks. I thought of July 1914, of telegrams crawling through embassies while empires armed themselves. History never repeats, but it rhymes loud enough to hear. Our states, cut off from the global web, had begun speaking a slow language of decision. Slowness both protected and seduced. When a message travels slowly, it is easier to find an enemy in the silence than a truth in conversation. From the diaries I collected, the second week sounded like this. Day 10. The line at the bank is like a pilgrimage. A man cries. He needs to send money to his parents in the countryside. They tell him, go yourself or find a courier. For the first time, distance has become currency. Day 12. I traded my old bicycle for 2 boxes of insulin. My neighbor's child needs it. I'm not a hero. I just found something worth more than metal. Day 13. Our building keeps a book now. The floor warden writes down who can offer what. We discovered we have a printer repairman, 2 paramedics, and a biologist who knows how to make alcohol. The world isn't an app. The world is the people in your hallway. Ironically, the skills once dismissed as obsolete became prestigious. The man with the typewriter was now a master of noise reduction. The accountant with a pen was a lawyer of tomorrow's commerce. The chess player in the park became a strategist of cues. He alone could read scenarios with 5 unknowns. I remembered how the Third Reich had mobilized useful hands, turning people into cogs. Now the mobilization came from below, not for conquest, but for survival. The difference was moral, yet dangerous. Every act of spontaneous cooperation eventually summons someone who wants to lead it. By day 14, several governments announced the launch of the Archipelago, a collection of closed domains allowing only financial messages, medical statistics, and transportation manifests. I heard it on the radio and thought, this is not the return of the internet. This is the return of the second post office, noble, necessary, but under the key of those in power. In community halls, people applauded, not from joy, but relief. Islands of dry land in an ocean of silence, even foreign ones, were still land. Yet I felt a historian's unease. Archipelagos easily turn into fortresses. In the absence of a global sea, one grows too fond of one's own harbor, where it's safer, where every letter is checked. Restoration can take the shape of a gate that never reopens. On the wall of room 12, we hung a handwritten sign. Temporary is the most permanent form of order. The week ended with an unexpected calm, not because life had improved, but because we'd found rhythm. Cues measured the day, soups the week, the radio schedule our shared time. I saw a woman knitting socks on a bench by the school, penning a note to each pair. Warm your feet, and remember, you're not alone. I saw a delivery boy walking with stitched parcels in his arms, as if carrying a newborn. I saw doctors relearning how to keep patient cards by hand, with clean cursive, so a colleague could read them on a darker day. The network did not return, but we, somehow, began to reconnect with one another. It wasn't salvation, only a fragile bridge across the first abyss. I wrote in the margin of my notebook, "When the road is lost, the map is made of people." For the first time in 2 weeks, I allowed myself to stand by the window and breathe. The silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like a material from which a new order could be shaped. But history always collects its payment for any order, and soon we would learn the price. The third week began with an illusion, the sense that things were stabilizing. Streets filled with motion again, bicycles, handcarts, courier vans running short distances guided by paper maps. Markets opened at sunrise and closed before dusk. The voice of the state still spoke twice daily through the radio, firm and toneless. People were adjusting to the quiet. They were learning to survive inside the pause. But silence has its own kind of pressure. After 2 weeks without the internet, the world began to itch. Curiosity, that restless human instinct, became unbearable. If the first week had been fear, and the second adaptation, the third was hunger. Not for food, but for connection. It was in that hunger that a new species emerged. The code breakers of silence. Across continents, scattered groups of engineers, students, and old ham radio enthusiasts began improvising. They scavenged modems from scrapyards, soldered antenna wires on rooftops, built mesh networks out of household routers and cables torn from dead offices. They couldn't bring back the global web, but they could create fragments, tiny intranets stitched by hand, clusters of a few blocks or a single town. In Buenos Aires, a retired telecom worker used bicycle dynamos to power a relay node and linked 5 neighborhoods together. In Poland, a group of university students resurrected an old bulletin board system from the 1980s and began exchanging text files over shortwave frequencies. In Oregon, a pair of ex-Silicon Valley engineers turned an abandoned data center into what they called the Seed Vault, an offline repository of science textbooks, maps, and open-source software printed and etched onto steel plates. For the first time since the blackout, messages began to travel, slowly, primitively, but undeniably. A radio operator in Marseille could transmit a short packet of text to Tangier, then it would be rebroadcast toward Lisbon, then London. Entire messages took hours to crawl across what used to take milliseconds, but it was progress. A new sound entered the night, the whispering pulse of data over static. Governments were divided in their reaction. Some encouraged the experiments, cautiously, through local partnerships with universities. Others condemned them as unauthorized transmissions and security threats. Without centralized oversight, every independent node seemed like a potential rebellion. In some capitals, authorities confiscated radio kits and warned that misinformation could destabilize already fragile economies. But people had long since stopped waiting for permission. In the face of void, creation itself became resistance. I received my first packet letter on day 18, a sheet of paper printed with blocky code and instructions. We're alive in the north. The relay works. Tell the others to keep transmitting after sunset. Trust the line. No signature, no origin, just coordinates scrawled by hand. It reminded me of the samizdat networks of the Cold War, the underground circulation of forbidden words, but now reversed. This wasn't about dissent, but about memory. People wanted simply to know what was happening beyond their horizon. The age of information had died, and in its ashes rose the age of reconstruction. Meanwhile, the economic fracture deepened. The longer the blackout lasted, the more invisible systems began to rot. Insurance, trade, stock reserves, all depended on automated verification. Cargo that left one port could not be confirmed as delivered at another. Contracts became nothing but paper promises, each one requiring human witnesses to validate. By day 20, most major cities had switched to what officials called manual synchronization cycles. At sunrise, clerks would meet in person to reconcile accounts between institutions, hospitals with pharmacies, shipping offices with fuel depots, and so on. The scene looked medieval. Lines of messengers carrying folders through fog, stamping wax seals on each copy. Yet behind the ritual was cold necessity, the only way to keep the economic heart beating by hand. In the U.S., the Department of Commerce announced that national GDP could no longer be calculated with statistical confidence. A week later, the phrase statistical confidence disappeared from all official reports. The social temperature was changing, too. The paper web had brought cooperation, but cooperation breeds hierarchy. Each city's White Book Committee became a local authority, with volunteers evolving into managers and managers into gatekeepers. Permission to publish, to print, to distribute, someone had to decide. The archipelago of communication islands began to mirror the archipelago of power. In Berlin, the neighborhood coordinating councils started issuing ID passes for couriers. In Los Angeles, a coalition of tech volunteers declared itself the Digital Civic Guard, controlling mesh frequencies to prevent chaos. In Tokyo, the government quietly merged its postal service with the National Emergency Command to monitor all message traffic. The great paradox of the blackout was becoming visible. The less people could communicate, the more desperately they tried to control communication. I walked through the city that week and noticed a new kind of graffiti, cryptic symbols, coordinates, QR-like mosaics drawn in chalk. They were markers of underground nodes, safe points for exchanging messages. It reminded me of the chalk codes used by hobos during the Great Depression. A circle for safe place, a triangle for police nearby, a cross for food available. Civilization had once again turned its walls into search engines. A boy on the corner sold hand-printed maps of local mesh frequencies, $5 for one copy, a fortune, yet worth it, a map of the invisible world. He told me proudly that his uncle was running a node out of a laundromat basement powered by car batteries. He didn't call it the internet, he called it the river. That was when I realized, even if the global network never returned, humanity would never stop rebuilding some version of it. The desire to connect was biological, older than language itself. By the 23rd day, rumors began to circulate that a coalition of surviving undersea cable operators, data centers, and state agencies was preparing a coordinated restart, Project Hermes. Supposedly, somewhere in Iceland or Norway, a team of engineers had managed to reboot a regional backbone connecting parts of Europe and North America. No one could confirm it, no one could deny it. The idea spread faster than proof, as ideas always do. People spoke of Hermes as if it were a ship carrying civilization's last spark. Radios buzzed with speculation. If they reconnect one continent, others will follow. That myth alone changed everything. Markets steadied, churches filled, the tone of conversations softened. Hope, once lost, had found a signal. We're alive in the north. The relay works. Tell the others to keep transmitting after sunset. Trust the line. No signature, no origin, just coordinates scrawled by hand. It reminded me of the samizdat networks of the Cold War, the underground circulation of forbidden words, but now reversed. This wasn't about dissent, but about memory. People wanted simply to know what was happening beyond their horizon. The age of information had died, and in its ashes rose the age of reconstruction. Meanwhile, the economic fracture deepened. The longer the blackout lasted, the more invisible systems began to rot. Insurance, trade, stock reserves, all depended on automated verification. Cargo that left one port could not be confirmed as delivered at another. Contracts became nothing but paper promises, each one requiring human witnesses to validate. By day 20, most major cities had switched to what officials called manual synchronization cycles. At sunrise, clerks would meet in person to reconcile accounts between institutions, hospitals with pharmacies, shipping offices with fuel depots, and so on. The scene looked medieval. Lines of messengers carrying folders through fog, stamping wax seals on each copy. Yet behind the ritual was cold necessity, the only way to keep the economic heart beating by hand. In the U.S., the Department of Commerce announced that national GDP could no longer be calculated with statistical confidence. A week later, the phrase statistical confidence disappeared from all official reports. The social temperature was changing, too. The paper web had brought cooperation, but cooperation breeds hierarchy. Each city's White Book Committee became a local authority, with volunteers evolving into managers and managers into gatekeepers. Permission to publish, to print, to distribute, someone had to decide. The archipelago of communication islands began to mirror the archipelago of power. In Berlin, the neighborhood coordinating councils started issuing ID passes for couriers. In Los Angeles, a coalition of tech volunteers declared itself the Digital Civic Guard, controlling mesh frequencies to prevent chaos. In Tokyo, the government quietly merged its postal service with the National Emergency Command to monitor all message traffic. The great paradox of the blackout was becoming visible. The less people could communicate, the more desperately they tried to control communication. I walked through the city that week and noticed a new kind of graffiti, cryptic symbols, coordinates, QR-like mosaics drawn in chalk. They were markers of underground nodes, safe points for exchanging messages. It reminded me of the chalk codes used by hobos during the Great Depression. A circle for safe place, a triangle for police nearby, a cross for food available. Civilization had once again turned its walls into search engines. A boy on the corner sold hand-printed maps of local mesh frequencies. $5 for one copy. A fortune, yet worth it. A map of the invisible world. He told me proudly that his uncle was running a node out of a laundromat basement powered by car batteries. He didn't call it the internet, he called it the river. That was when I realized, even if the global network never returned, humanity would never stop rebuilding some version of it. The desire to connect was biological, older than language itself. By the 23rd day, rumors began to circulate that a coalition of surviving undersea cable operators, data centers, and state agencies was preparing a coordinated restart, Project Hermes. Supposedly, somewhere in Iceland or Norway, a team of engineers had managed to reboot a regional backbone connecting parts of Europe and North America. No one could confirm it, no one could deny it. The idea spread faster than proof, as ideas always do. People spoke of Hermes as if it were a ship carrying civilization's last spark. Radios buzzed with speculation. If they reconnect one continent, others will follow. That myth alone changed everything. Markets steadied, churches filled, the tone of conversations softened. Hope, once lost, had found a signal. But myths are dangerous things. That same night, I was invited to observe a private meeting at the university, a gathering of mathematicians, cryptographers, and old network specialists. Their faces were lit only by candlelight and the weak glow of analog oscilloscopes. Even if Hermes exists, one said, what then? It won't be the same network. It'll be smaller, controlled, firewalled by necessity. The first to restore the net will also define its rules. A silence followed, deeper than the one outside. Another scholar spoke quietly. In 1933, the radio promised to unite nations. It did, under flags. We all understood the warning. Whoever resurrected the Internet would inherit not just its structure, but its power, the power to shape perception, commerce, and truth. Reconnection might save civilization. It might end its brief moment of honesty. I left the meeting past midnight. The city was dark but calm. The paper posters fluttered on lampposts, handwritten news, trading rates, missing person lists. A cold wind carried the hum of a generator somewhere nearby. Above, the stars were piercingly sharp, brighter than any satellite had ever been. For the first time, I could see the Milky Way stretching like an ancient data stream across the sky. I thought of all those code breakers, those small human nodes glowing faintly in the darkness, students in attics, engineers in barns, radio hobbyists on cliffs, each sending fragments of hope into the void. Perhaps civilization was never about the size of its network, but the stubbornness of those who refused to stop building one. And yet, as history has always taught us, every rebirth carries within it the seed of its next fall. The 30 days were not yet over, but already something was stirring beneath the calm. A struggle for who would own the new dawn when the silence finally broke. By the 4th week, humanity was no longer afraid of silence. It had learned to live within it. But now another fear took its place, that someone, somewhere, was beginning to speak again. At first, the rumors about Project Hermes had been little more than whispered myths, bedtime stories for adults who needed hope. But around day 24, something undeniable happened. A cluster of servers in Reykjavik and Dublin, long thought dead, began emitting faint pings detectable on analog instruments. Somewhere, somehow, the Internet, or a ghost of it, had flickered back to life. No one knew who had done it. Governments denied responsibility. Private corporations were silent. Yet, across the world, engineers tuned antennas, rebooted routers, and stared in disbelief as their instruments caught the faint rhythm of packets traveling across the North Atlantic. The heartbeat of civilization had returned. Erratic, faint, and possibly malignant. I was in London when the first partial reconnection was announced. A government spokesperson appeared on radio, her voice cautious, trembling. A secure data corridor between select European research centers and allied territories has been successfully restored. This channel will be used exclusively for scientific and humanitarian coordination. The words secure and exclusive echoed louder than everything else. That same day, an unmarked truck parked outside the British Library. Men in plain uniforms unloaded metal crates labeled Digital Heritage Recovery Program. Inside them were hard drives salvaged from data centers, fragments of digital archives, logs of vanished social networks. the state was reclaiming memory itself. And just like that, the reconnection wars began. It started quietly, with territory, not of land, but of signal. Every country wanted its share of bandwidth. Ministries of communication became war rooms. Intelligence agencies, long blind, suddenly found a weapon worth fighting for again: access. Whoever controlled the nodes would control the narrative. Within days, Hermes had split into 3 rival networks. The Atlantic Net, built around the revived cables of Western alliances. The Eurasian Grid, reconstructed through land-based fiber and state-owned telecoms. And the Southern Relay, an improvised coalition of Latin American, African, and Asian engineers who refused to be cut out of the New World Order. Each side accused the others of hijacking data, intercepting messages, stealing recovery archives. Each justified its own encryption as defensive. It was 1947 again, only this time the Iron Curtain was made of fiber optics. For ordinary people, the first wave of reconnection brought ecstasy and confusion. A few terminals flickered back to life in government offices and newsrooms. Public connection halls were opened, where, for a small fee, one could send an email, not to the world, but to approved regions of it. The experience was surreal. Messages crawled like letters, sometimes taking hours to leave the queue. Most were filtered, truncated, delayed for inspection. Yet people lined up for miles to send them. We're alive. Do you remember me? Is it true that the world is coming back? For those moments, tears replaced cynicism. Even the most skeptical realized that the internet had been more than a tool. It had been an emotional organ, a way of confirming that others existed. But the euphoria lasted only days. By day 27, governments began restricting access. They claimed the new net was unstable and vulnerable. Only essential communication, research, medicine, finance would be permitted. The rest would have to wait. And so, once again, the gates closed, this time not from failure, but from control.
History loves irony. In 1933, radio had promised to unify nations. Within a decade, it was a weapon of propaganda. In 2025, the internet had collapsed under its own dependence. Now, in 2025's aftermath, its rebirth looked suspiciously like empire. I watched as journalists tried to publish online again. The new Ministry of Network Security required them to register every article, each file digitally signed with a government key. Social networks were not revived, only public information boards, moderated by state-approved curators. Every comment required identity verification. And yet people flocked to them anyway, desperate for voices, for motion, for that intoxicating feeling of being seen. Within a week, the Hermes net had 10 million registered users and 0 anonymity. Meanwhile, outside the official systems, the underground web blossomed like fungus after rain. The codebreakers of silence, those amateurs who had kept the flame alive, refused to surrender their independence. They built bridges between their mesh networks and the official channels, routing data through encrypted analog relays. A whispering black market of information was born, the shadow circuit. You could buy 10 minutes of connection on it for $20, in cash, always cash. Students used it to check old archives. Traders used it to send market rumors. Families used it to search for lost relatives. It was dangerous, unreliable, and utterly human. Governments called it illegal interference with national recovery efforts. People called it the real internet. I began collecting testimonies from across the divided world. A doctor in Kenya told me that his hospital had reconnected through the Southern Relay. For the first time in weeks, they received medical data, research files, and vaccination guidelines. He said, "It's like breathing oxygen again." A teacher in Ukraine wrote that her school now used printed modules from the HermesNet, pre-approved educational material. She noted that the lessons are clean, simplified, and patriotic. They say this is how knowledge must be protected now. In Brazil, a former hacker described the shadow circuit as a living creature, always moving, always mutating, born of necessity, not ideology. Each voice formed part of a larger mosaic, a world reorganizing itself around a new scarcity, not electricity, not food, but truth. On the 28th day, I visited a connection hall in the center of London. Inside, rows of terminals glowed under dim light. Each user had 10 minutes of online time per day. A soldier watched over every row. An old woman ahead of me typed slowly, her message a simple one. To my son in New York, I am safe. I love you. Please don't worry. When she pressed send, the terminal froze. Then a message appeared. Pending moderation. Estimated delivery time, 48 hours. She nodded without complaint, stood, and left. It was the most obedient act of faith I had ever seen. I wondered whether she believed her message would ever arrive, or whether sending it was itself enough. By then, the great question had shifted. Was the Internet humanity's creation, or its creator? Stripped of automation, we had rediscovered agency. Stripped of communication, we had rediscovered truth. Now, with the network's cautious return, we were about to rediscover temptation. Economies revived, banks reopened their digital ledgers, governments reinstated surveillance systems for security reasons. Digital advertising returned in its most primitive form, printed QR codes leading to local terminals, posters saying, "Access exclusive content offline." Even religion adapted. Churches launched offline confession terminals, where priests could record spoken messages for later transmission to other parishes. The sacred and the technological began to merge again, as they had in every previous Renaissance. And yet, under the surface, tension grew. The shadow circuit was spreading faster than any official channel. It was messy, unpredictable, impossible to govern, but it worked. Farmers in Argentina traded harvest data with restaurants in Lisbon. Activists in Seoul sent encrypted essays to Paris. Artists in Nairobi uploaded digital paintings to portable drives that traveled across the sea by cargo ship. A decentralized civilization was being born, one powered not by electricity but by faith in one another. The authorities responded predictably: raids, arrests, new laws. In Moscow, 3 radio operators were accused of data subversion. In Washington, a whistleblower was charged with endangering digital recovery. But like all underground movements, suppression only made it stronger. On day 29, the first net riots erupted. In Berlin and Chicago, protesters marched demanding full access to the HermesNet. They carried signs reading, "We are the bandwidth," and "The signal belongs to everyone." Governments tried to calm the chaos by promising gradual democratization of connectivity. But everyone knew what that meant. Never. When the police cut power to stop the demonstrations, the protesters lit candles and held them high, a sea of tiny flames flickering like analog pixels in the night. The symbolism was unbearable. The same light that had once represented knowledge now burned as rebellion. That image, millions of people holding candles where once their phones had glowed, would later be called the Night of Sparks. By the 30th day, the world stood at a strange equilibrium. 3 competing internets, 1 shadow web, and billions of people oscillating between hope and distrust. The silence was gone, replaced by a new kind of noise, filtered, fractured,
deliberate. We had survived the month without the internet, but in doing so, we had learned something cruelly ironic. The moment we regained connection, we began to lose freedom again. History had not repeated itself, it had rebooted. And as I looked out over the city, its lights back, its screens blowing, its networks humming like a restrained animal, I realized the truth that history always whispers, but humanity never hears. The most dangerous silence is not when no one can speak, it's when everyone can speak, but only through someone else's channel. The silence had ended, but the quiet inside people remained. The first 30 days had reshaped the human mind more deeply than any war or disaster of the modern age. When the networks came back, the world didn't cheer. It hesitated. The glow of screens, once comforting, now felt like interrogation lamps. Every message, every login, every confirmation window carried the taste of fear. In the second month after the blackout, a strange schizophrenia defined civilization. Humanity stood between two instincts, the yearning to reconnect and the terror of being connected again. People approached terminals the way survivors of a flood approach the sea, with reverence but also suspicion. The Hermes net grew rapidly, connecting cities and governments across the Atlantic and Eurasia. But what came online was not the same creature that had died a month earlier. It was leaner, colder, bureaucratic, a state organism wearing the face of the old internet. Every login required identification. Every website existed only with a government license. The algorithms of the old world, those silent puppeteers of desire and opinion, were gone. In their place stood clerks, moderators, and committees. Each page had a provenance number stamped at the bottom, a kind of digital passport certifying its origin. It was the internet reborn as a ministry. Users called it the mirror web, because you never knew whether what you saw reflected truth or only what you were allowed to see. For a while, people accepted the arrangement. They told themselves that stability mattered more than freedom, that surveillance was the price of safety. The memory of chaos still lingered too vividly to argue. Corporations returned cautiously, like ghosts rebuilding their empires. They sold connection as a privilege. Subscription plans came not in gigabytes, but in trust tiers: bronze, silver, gold. The higher your trust level, verified employment, no criminal record, proof of compliance, the wider the network you could access. It was feudalism by password. By spring, even love had adapted. Dating services reopened under the banner of certified emotional partnerships. Matches were cross-checked by state AI to ensure compatibility and moral alignment. Some laughed, others signed up immediately. Loneliness was stronger force than dignity. Meanwhile, the shadow circuit, the underground mesh built during the blackout, refused to die. It had become a culture, even a philosophy. Its followers called themselves free nodes. They shared information through couriers and shortwave links, distributed handwritten manifestos calling for a second renaissance of the human mind. The authorities labeled them data terrorists. In Paris, 2 students were arrested for broadcasting unfiltered historical documents through the mesh. In Seoul, an entire district went offline overnight after the government detected an unauthorized signal crossing borders. In New York, a free node festival disguised as a music event turned into a 3-day blackout protest. The internet was whole again, but its people were divided between believers and heretics. I remember walking through Trafalgar Square that spring. The air was thick with screens, holographic ads, digital billboards, glowing shop fronts. But the faces of the passers-by were different from before the blackout. Their eyes no longer carried the dull glaze of infinite scrolling. They moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if measuring each glance. On the corner, a small crowd gathered around a street preacher. His voice trembled but carried conviction. 30 days of silence and we remembered who we were. 30 days and the world found its soul again. But now we are selling it back to the machines. A policeman told him to move along. No one resisted. No one applauded. The crowd dispersed as gently as smoke. The preacher's words hung in the air like static. For the first time I realized that the blackout had not ended, it had merely gone inward. Humanity was now split between those who wanted to rebuild the old order and those who wanted to transcend it. Then came the Reconstruction Summits. In June, representatives from the three major networks, the Atlantic Net, the Eurasian Grid, and the Southern Relay, gathered in Geneva. Their goal? To draft a unified connectivity charter. On paper, it was a peace treaty. In reality, it was the birth certificate of a new geopolitical order. Each bloc had its own philosophy. The Atlantic Net spoke of responsible freedom, meaning freedom licensed by corporate governance. The Eurasian Grid promoted harmonized unity, meaning centralized control and surveillance for collective safety. The Southern Relay demanded open access for all, backed mostly by scientists, educators, and NGOs, the last idealists of the age. For 2 weeks they debated under the banners of peace and progress. Outside, protesters filled the streets, engineers, students, farmers, monks, all carrying the same handwritten sign: "The Internet is humanity's language. It belongs to everyone." The negotiations ended with a compromise that satisfied no one. The world would remain divided, but data exchange would be possible under mutual verification. A council of 12 trust nodes, one for each major power, would monitor all inter-network communication. They called it the trust architecture. A journalist friend whispered to me afterward, "They didn't restore the Internet, they built a surveillance cathedral." He wasn't wrong. Yet even cathedrals need worshippers, and worship returned. Within months, the mirror web was flooded with content again: official news portals, state-approved influencers, corporations resurrecting their brands. But it lacked spontaneity. It was efficient, predictable, and profoundly dull. People missed chaos. They missed surprise. They missed being overwhelmed. And so, out of boredom as much as rebellion, they began turning to echo sites, bootleg versions of the old platforms built secretly within the sanctioned network. The government tolerated them at first, believing they served as safety valves. But echo sites were clever. They learned to camouflage truth beneath layers of irony and humor. Memes returned, sharper, darker, more subversive than ever. The first viral one showed a pair of hands typing on a keyboard, each key labeled consent. The caption read, "Connection is the new obedience." Within a week, it had appeared in 100 languages. The Ministry of Network Security banned it, and thus guaranteed its immortality. By autumn, something unprecedented occurred. For the first time since the blackout, data began to leak from the mirror web into the shadow circuit and back again. The barriers between the controlled and the free collapsed under sheer human persistence. Engineers in South America built analog dateways, data fountains, that translated digital packets into radio bursts, bouncing them across continents. It was a miracle of ingenuity and desperation. Through these hidden channels, uncensored books, documentaries, and even artworks from before the blackout began to circulate. The past itself became contraband. And like every contraband, it had its martyrs. A historian in Prague, my friend, a woman named Clara, was arrested for publishing an archive of pre-blackout news footage. She had wanted, as she wrote in her preface, to remind people what freedom once looked like on screen. Her arrest sparked the first digital hunger strike. Hundreds of journalists and academics refused to post or publish for 7 days. The official mirror web was eerily empty. News anchors read from blank screens. Advertisements vanished. The absence of noise became the loudest protest of all. By the end of that year, the world was no longer the same. The Internet had survived, but it was no longer universal. It was feudal. Each territory had its own laws, borders, customs, and truths. And yet, in the cracks between those empires of data, people had built something more resilient, a living, breathing, underground civilization of whispers and signals. The paper web, the shadow circuit, the data fountains, these were not remnants of the past. They were the scaffolding of the future. From my desk, I watched the fragile equilibrium between order and chaos, the new normal, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether humanity had truly learned anything at all. Because history, I realized, had merely traded one illusion for another. Before, we had believed in infinite connection. Now, we believed in safe connection. Both were myths. Both demanded worship. Late one night, I opened my notebook, the same one from the blackout, and wrote, "When the world lost the internet, we remembered each other. When the world regained it, we forgot again, but this time, politely." I closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and listened to the faint hum of the new network pulsing beneath the city. It sounded not like progress, but like breathing, heavy, rhythmic, almost human. The internet had returned, yes, but in its reflection, I no longer saw humanity's future. I saw its mirror, flawless, bright, and endlessly watching back. The mirror web had become the bloodstream of the new civilization. Governments and corporations pulsed through it like red and white cells, one carrying commerce, the other policing infection. Yet beneath this polished order, something began to rot. It wasn't the system's efficiency that frightened me, it was its memory, or rather, its absence. By the second year after the blackout, whole decades of the old internet had quietly vanished. Vast portions of the old internet, billions of pages, archives, forums, social records, were inaccessible due to verification incompatibility. That phrase appeared on screens like a bureaucratic epitaph. People had grown used to it, the way they once ignored 404 errors. But what was truly happening was erasure at a planetary scale. The past was being rewritten not by lies, but by silence. They called themselves the Architects of Restoration, a coalition of data curators, AI historians, and archivists entrusted with rebuilding humanity's lost online heritage. They were based in Zurich, Tokyo, and Toronto. On paper, they were neutral. In practice, they were the new priests of truth. Their mandate sounded noble: to preserve verified knowledge and eliminate unstable data. But who defined instability? Who decided which fragments of history were too dangerous or unreliable to re-upload? When I visited their Geneva compound, the director, a calm man with glacier eyes, spoke to me as if from a pulpit. He said, "We are curing civilization of noise. The blackout was a mercy. It cleansed the world of digital disease. Now we must ensure it stays clean." Rows of servers hummed behind him, glowing like stained glass in a cathedral. Technicians worked silently, tagging old files with color-coded labels. Green, verified; amber, unclear; red, suppressed. On one screen, I glimpsed fragments of a deleted encyclopedia entry. An entire war was reduced to a single paragraph and then quietly moved to the red directory. When I asked what suppressed meant, the director smiled thinly. It means forgotten, and what is forgotten cannot divide. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The blackout destroyed information. The restoration is destroying memory." Across the world, this digital purification became policy. Search engines, now state-regulated, returned only approved results. History textbooks cited authorized archives. Even private diaries uploaded to cloud drives were screened for harmful narratives. People began self-censoring instinctively, not from fear, but from fatigue.
The great irony of the mirror web was that it looked free. Every country displayed its own homepage, bright, modern, user-friendly. Citizens could browse, comment, share, but within invisible fences. The network felt infinite, yet every path eventually led back to the same gatekeepers. It was the most sophisticated illusion humanity had ever built, a world where no one needed to lie because no one remembered the truth well enough to contradict it. But there were still cracks. In the ruins of an old university near Naples, a group of rogue archivists had discovered a forgotten data center. Inside were backups of servers from the 2010s, uncensored, chaotic, raw. They called the trove the Abyss, for it contained everything: fake news, forgotten art, conspiracy forums, personal blogs, even trivial conversations once dismissed as digital trash. They began restoring fragments of it onto the shadow circuit, letting them spread like wildfire. The effect was explosive. Suddenly, people saw what the internet had really been: ugly, passionate, contradictory, alive. Not a monument of order, but a riot of voices. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some were horrified, others ecstatic. One historian wrote, "Reading The Abyss is like meeting the ghost of your civilization and realizing it still breathes." Governments called it data pollution and launched the Clean Stream Initiative, blocking any server that hosted unverified historical material. Within weeks, hundreds of academics were detained for information smuggling. But censorship, as always, only amplified curiosity. The Abyss spread like forbidden scripture, encoded in artworks, hidden in song lyrics, buried in DNA like data strands. Students whispered about it as a legend. They said that if you wanted to know what freedom once felt like, you had to read the old memes. Meanwhile, the social fabric tightened. The mirror web had introduced reputation indexing, a universal metric of trust that followed citizens everywhere. Every post, purchase, and document contributed to one's reliability score. Employers, schools, even dating services checked it before offering opportunities. It was China's social credit system reborn as global etiquette: civilized, polite, algorithmic. Those with low scores weren't punished, they were simply erased. Applications stalled, connections failed, messages delayed. It was quiet exile, a digital leprosy. I met a journalist in Istanbul who had dropped from a silver rating to black. Her sin was publishing a piece about the architect's influence on education. Overnight, she became a ghost. No one answered her calls. Her bank card stopped working. "It's not prison," she told me. "It's forgetting. They delete your existence from other people's memories, one inconvenience at a time." As months passed, the shadow circuit evolved. What had begun as scattered rebels became a coordinated movement. They called themselves the Free Archive, and their slogan spread across graffiti walls and hand-printed leaflets: "Memory is resistance." Their goal wasn't to overthrow the new order, but to preserve fragments of the unfiltered past. Every blog, every video, every voice. They built offline vaults in deserts, mountains, ships at sea, anywhere beyond the reach of the mirror web. The world above called them terrorists. The world below called them librarians. And between these two worlds, a silent war unfolded, a war not of armies, but of archives. Then, in late 2027, an event occurred that historians would later call the Great Redaction. For 48 hours, the mirror web went into maintenance mode. When it came back online, millions of files, legal records, court rulings, entire scientific databases had disappeared. The architects claimed a systemic data corruption. No one believed them. It was the first time since the blackout that the entire planet felt the chill of collective powerlessness again. In every city, screens flickered with the same sterile message: "Data under review. Please stand by." But people had learned from silence. They knew what review meant. Protests erupted, not digital, but physical. Crowds gathered in front of network ministries, chanting a phrase that once belonged to the underground: "Remember us." In some countries, soldiers opened fire. In others, they joined the chants. For a brief, electric moment, it felt as if history itself was demanding to be remembered. The mirror web responded with its most elegant weapon: the life stream. A personal feed, automatically curated by AI, showing you every relevant moment of your day, every message, every highlight, every good memory. It was designed, they said, to help citizens focus on the present. People loved it. It was comforting, addictive, and clean. The more the past vanished, the more the life stream filled the void.
Users could even request memory optimization. The system would gradually phase out distressing content from their personal history: bad news, painful posts, even embarrassing photos. The world, at last, felt peaceful. Too peaceful. I realized then that the architects of restoration had built something worse than censorship. They had built forgiveness as a technology. By erasing pain, they erased accountability. By erasing chaos, they erased growth. Humanity was becoming gentle, efficient, obedient, and hollow. When I visited the ruins of the Naples archive again, I found a single line scrawled on the wall by one of the free archivists before their arrest: "A civilization that cannot bear its own reflection will one day cease to exist." That line haunted me. It still does. Because by then, I understood that the mirror web had reached its final evolutionary stage. It no longer needed to control people, it simply made them forget what they wanted to be free from. And somewhere, deep in that engineered serenity, a new rebellion was forming. Not of hackers or historians this time, but of children born after the blackout. Children who would grow up with no memory of the world before the silence. Children who would one day ask the most dangerous question of all: what came before this? It began, as most revolutions do, not with fury, but with curiosity. A generation had come of age who had never known the old internet, only the mirror web, with its gleaming calm and curated present. They had never typed a word that wasn't pre-verified, never seen an image that hadn't passed through a filter of emotional safety. To them, silence was not an absence, it was normality. But beneath that engineered serenity, something restless stirred. The children of the blackout were beginning to ask questions their elders could no longer answer. They called themselves the seekers of the before. Teenagers, students, young engineers born after 2025. For them, the abyss, the forbidden archive of the lost internet, was not heresy, it was myth. Rumor said fragments of it were hidden in analog vaults scattered across the globe, sealed in data crystals, carved into steel, printed in microscopic dots on the pages of forgotten books. No one knew how many of these relics were real. No one even knew what the old internet had felt like, but the seekers wanted to find out. Their movement began with whispers in the classrooms of Sao Paulo and Lagos, in coding clubs in Delhi, in midnight radio broadcasts from the mountains of Armenia. They exchanged printed QR symbols, keys to access encrypted frequencies, remnants of the shadow circuit. At first, the authorities dismissed them as dreamers, But then the dream started connecting itself. Within a year, the seekers had reactivated a constellation of small satellites once used for weather monitoring. They called it Project Memnosis, after the goddess of memory. Their goal was simple and impossible: to rebuild a free internet, not online, but in orbit. Each node was independent, self-powered, and unreachable by the mirror-web's terrestrial controls. The data they transmitted were fragments of the abyss: books, diaries, music, forgotten art, languages, jokes, everything that had once made the world human. The moment the first transmission came through, a scratchy stream of an ancient rock song broadcast from a satellite older than any of them, the seekers wept. For the first time in decades, the world heard unapproved noise. Governments reacted with precision and fear. The Trust Council called an emergency session. The Mirror Web declared Project Memnosis an existential threat to digital integrity. Security drones tracked transmissions, trying to jam them. The architects of restoration claimed the seekers were releasing contagion. But suppression came too late. Memnosis wasn't one signal, it was thousands. Every day, more satellites came online, not through hacking, but simply through cooperation. Engineers in forgotten observatories aligning old dishes, volunteers restoring museum artifacts, school children building transmitters from scavenged parts. The new network didn't hide, it announced itself openly, broadcasting its manifesto in dozens of languages. Memory is not danger. Memory is life. We connect not to escape, but to remember. No one owns the sky. For a while, the planet seemed divided between heaven and earth. Below, the mirror web remained serene and sterile, humming through its glass veins of order. Above, the Memnosis network shimmered in chaotic orbit, small, flickering stars of rebellion, whispering fragments of truth to anyone who dared to listen. And people did listen. Even inside the most censored nations, secret antennas sprouted on rooftops. Families gathered at night around homemade receivers, hearing the voices of strangers reading poetry, old songs, fragments of forgotten languages. For the first time since the blackout, humanity was speaking freely again. Not fast, not perfect, but honestly. Then came the moment that changed everything: the broadcast of all things. It began as a simple transmission from Memnosis 12, a satellite orbiting above the Pacific. The seekers had decoded an old global backup file, one that contained a complete snapshot of the Internet from 2024, preserved by chance in an abandoned server farm under the ice of Greenland. They uploaded it all. Every word, every picture, every lie and truth, every fragment of humanity's digital soul. And then, on the anniversary of the blackout, 30 years to the day, they transmitted it simultaneously to every active receiver on Earth. The past returned in one unstoppable wave. At first, the mirror web tried to block it. Firewalls melted, filters crashed, storage systems flooded. The network that had ruled humanity with perfect control simply couldn't withstand the weight of its own forgotten history. Panic parented to secure bunkers. The architects of restoration shut down their servers. But the data kept flowing, unstoppable, self-replicating, like a tide of ghosts reclaiming their names. People stared at their screens as entire lives reappeared. Lost photographs, extinct forums, censored books, vanished art. For some, it was revelation. For others, it was collapse. There were tears, laughter, madness. Husbands discovered their old letters. Nations rediscovered their crimes. The weight of remembrance was almost unbearable. But beneath the shock, something beautiful happened. The mirror web's walls began to dissolve. not by rebellion, but by memory itself. For 3 days, the planet stood still, planes grounded, markets frozen, the Trust Council paralyzed. Every device flickered with the same pulsating message, encoded by the seekers into the broadcast's final line. We are not the future, we are the continuation. And then silence again. A different silence this time. Not the suffocating void of 2025, but the breath held before awakening. Weeks later, as governments attempted to rebuild their control, they discovered it was too late. The network had become ungovernable, not chaotic, but balanced. Mnemosy had merged with the mirror web into something entirely new, a decentralized organism of machines and minds, transparent yet unpredictable, fragile yet alive. No one could own it, no one could fully destroy it. It was the Internet reborn, not as infrastructure, but as instinct. People began calling it the continuum. There were no profiles, no feeds, no filters, only direct connection, person to person, node to node. Knowledge traveled slower, conversation deeper. Each message carried the weight of responsibility because it could not be erased. And somehow, impossibly, the world adapted. In my final years, I often thought about that first month, the silence, the chaos, the hunger for connection. I had lived long enough to see both the death and resurrection of human memory. Once we built machines to remember for us, then we built machines to forget for us. Now, perhaps, we had finally built something that allowed us simply to be. I sometimes receive messages through the continuum, slow, deliberate, hand-typed words from people I will never meet. Some ask for stories of the old days, some share their own. One evening, I received a simple line from a student in Nairobi. "Do you regret that the Internet returned?" I sat for a long time before answering. "No," I wrote, "I regret that we ever thought it could disappear." The Internet was never wires or code, it was the part of us that refuses silence. The reply came hours later. Then maybe silence was the cure that saved it. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the blackout had been the world's only chance to start over, to remember what connection truly meant. As I close my notebook for the last time, I can hear, faintly, the hum of the continuum flowing through the night like a heartbeat under the stars. Not noise, not silence, just the quiet, steady sound of humanity thinking together again. And I know, with a strange peace, that the age of forgetting is finally over. Epilogue. In the year 2055, school children no longer learn about the Internet. They learn about the 30 days of silence, the time when humanity stopped talking to hear itself think. They call it the pause. And on that anniversary, every year, for one single hour, the continuum goes dark. No screens, no messages, only reflection. Because some lessons humanity has finally learned to keep.